very next day, the company announced that it had solved one of the greatest challenges facing sustainable energy, a high-density battery. This new prototype battery would provide 4 times the energy density of lithium-ion and could power a Tesla Model S for over 600 miles. On Twitter, Trevor claimed that he had seen this technology perform with his own eyes and promised a major demonstration. Riding high off the announcement, Nikola Motors began to receive serious attention, and Anheuser-Busch was first to jump on board, placing a pre-order for 800 trucks. Trevor estimated that the value of this new technology was to be worth hundreds of billions. The thing was, Nikola had no patent engineers, chemists, or research papers published. The truth was, Nikola had acquired the battery maker ZapGo for $56 million. As it turned out, ZapGo's technology was vaporware. It was a scam. It didn't exist. And so there it was. Nikola, who had misled so many, had been misled themselves. Interestingly, ZapGo was headed by Charles Resnick, a shady character who had just scammed NASA a few months before the Nikola deal. Charles used the money from NASA to hire numerous adult workers, certainly not a business expense. Charles would plead guilty in January of 2020, but once again, all of this didn't matter to Trevor. He was still on Twitter, touting the non-existent battery technology. With nothing more than the promise of a revolutionary truck that rolled down a hill and a game-changing battery technology that was purchased from a company that was a scam, Nikola went public on June 4, 2020. They did so through a technique called a reverse merger. The thing is, with reverse mergers, you don't have to disclose all the intricate details of your company, something that a regular IPO would require. This should have raised some red flags from investors if they knew more about the history of Nikola. But alas, investors were euphoric and Nikola shares spiked. Within 1 week of going public, the market value of Nikola surged past that of Ford, over $30 billion. To put things into perspective, Ford sold 5.5 million vehicles in 2019 with a revenue of $155 billion and had a market cap of around $28 billion. Nikola, on the other hand, sold nothing and was valued at $30 billion, making it the world's biggest truck maker without selling a single truck. And with that, overnight, Trevor became a multi-billionaire. It was settled, the markets had spoken. He was the next Elon Musk. Things would soon change for Trevor though, but not before one last cash grab. On September 8, 2020, Nikola Motors announced a $2 billion partnership with General Motors. GM was going to take an 11% stake in the company and manufacture their electric pickup truck, the Nikola Badger. So questions have to be asked. Did General Motors do no research, or was something else at play here? Despite the chaos, Nikola was again accepting pre-orders for their Badger truck. To date, no one has ever seen a Nikola Badger. They only exist as a rendering as far as the public is concerned. Finally, after lying for years and roping in some of the biggest companies, 2 days after the GM deal on September 10th, the short-selling investment firm Hindenburg Research released a scathing report calling Nikola Motors an intricate fraud. The firm said it had gathered extensive evidence, including recorded phone calls, text messages, private emails, and behind-the-scenes photographs detailing dozens of false statements by Milton. They accused him of lying about Nikola's technology. This was a bombshell report, and soon the gates were blown wide open.
We believe this is only the beginning of Nikola's unraveling. Nikola's almost no intellectual property, products, or revenue to fall back on. We think the company's key asset was its founder's ability to raise money through hype, and then the Hindenburg is saying outright lies.
Trevor Milton knew that this was the end, and he publicly promised a full rebuttal to all the damaging claims. But instead, he deleted his social media accounts and disappeared.
Trevor Milton, the founder of electric truck company Nikola, is voluntarily stepping down as executive chairman and giving up his board seat. This move comes after short seller Hindenburg Research accused Milton of making false statements about Nikola's technology in order to try and grow and secure partnerships with automakers. Both the Justice Department and the SEC are investigating allegations made by Hindenburg.
On the 21st of September, Trevor steps down from the chairman position, and former vice chairman of GM, Stefan Gursky, takes over. Nikola's stock plunged by 40%, and negotiations between Nikola and other partners stalled. And finally, a sexual assault allegation by Trevor's own cousin just added to the horrible mess. Many banks liquidated their Nikola stock, seemingly in disgust. The company received a myriad of subpoenas and investigations by the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Former vice chairman,
his company marketed as a
Nikola's stock plunged by 40%, and negotiations between Nikola and other partners stalled. And finally, a sexual assault allegation by Trevor's own cousin just added to the horrible mess. Many banks liquidated their Nikola stock, seemingly in disgust.
and electricity.
For every doubter out there that said that there's no way this is true, how can that be possible? We've done it.
But now the billionaire founder of Nikola Motor Company, Trevor Milton, is being charged with securities fraud.
Do you have anything to say about the charges?
We have a statement. Check it out.
Milton, seen leaving a Manhattan courthouse Thursday, charged by federal prosecutors who say he lied about every aspect of his truck of the future.
Milton claimed that the Nikola One could be driven, when in fact, the closest it ever came to driving was when a group of Nikola engineers took it to the top of a hill and rolled it down so it could be filmed for a commercial.
Prosecutors claiming the truck's door even had to be taped up for the video so it wouldn't fall off.
At the end of July 2021, a federal grand jury charged Trevor Milton with 3 counts of criminal fraud. The US Attorney's Office in Manhattan accused the 39-year-old billionaire of lying to investors, making false statements about the company, and wire fraud. The SEC also filed civil securities fraud charges against him, requiring the court to permanently bar him from acting as an officer and ordered him to pay fines as well as give back any revenue gained by his deceit. Trevor Milton, of course, denies all wrongdoing and has pleaded not guilty to the charges, but this will be a matter for the courts to decide. Since the charges, Nikola's stock has been steadily falling. Following the indictment, the company stated, quote, "We remain committed to our previously announced milestones and timelines and are focused on delivering Nikola Tre battery trucks later this year from the company's manufacturing facilities." Nikola continues to move forward under new management, but it has to be said, correcting the course of a company built on fraudulent claims by a compulsive liar is not going to be easy. The GM deal lies in limbo, and the stock price is at an all-time low, and faith in the company dwindles every day. Bosch, General Motors, and a slew of investors are left holding the bag. On a wider point, it's becoming clear that investors have collectively lost their minds. It seems as if they're only driven by lofty promises without doing a shred of research. Everyone was just so excited that they didn't want to look deeper, and herein lies the problem. Think of yourself as an inexperienced investor. You heard about this new company, and it just showed off a revolutionary truck. It was powered by new hydrogen technology, and also had amazing new battery technology. They had partnered with major companies like Bosch and BP, and this company has raised a lot of money. You'd think you've hit a gold mine. You'd also think that you've gotten in on the next Tesla. This whole train wreck really is the old adage, fake it until you make it. But what happens if the things that you promise turn out to be much harder than anticipated? When do you pass the point of no return and just keep lying until you get caught? For Milton, he just kept lying until the very end. In a way, the story of Trevor Milton and Nikola Motors.
So I want to show you one of our flips that ended up being...
Hi.
Who knows what tomorrow will bring? Maybe sunshine, maybe rain. But as for me, I'll wait and see. And maybe it'll bring my love to me.
Hi, welcome to another Cold Fusion video. Wirecard was once the model of tech startups in Germany. Last year, they were listed on the German equivalent of the Dow Jones among the top 30 companies. Wirecard wasn't just big, they were also innovators. The company had been dubbed among the top 100 most innovative growth companies by Forbes, and the company's promotional material wanted you to know that. Buzzwords like reimagining, reinventing, and innovation were often used. So how, in the space of just 9 days, did Wirecard's share price go from €100 a share to less than €2 a share? And how did the company end up in a place where they're filing for insolvency and owe creditors $4 billion? The answer lies in the fact that $2 billion is missing. the equivalent of the entire company's operating profit. Wirecard hid the fraud from financial and regulatory institutions, auditors, and the government. This was a tale of lies, accounting manipulation, hacking attacks on journalists, an arrested former CEO, and a missing executive. In this episode, we'll take a look at the Enron of Europe, Wirecard.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
Wirecard was founded in 1999 in a suburb in Munich, Germany. The firm provided online payment services, acting as an intermediary between consumers and producers online. The money transfers were fast, safe, and convenient. Riding off the back of the e-commerce boom, the company became a giant. In the space of 5 years, they saw its share price increase tenfold. CEO at the time, Markus Braun, became a billionaire by owning 7% of the shares. By 2005, they had developed a core business in managing the payments of online gambling and adult content. Despite shady beginnings, through a series of acquisitions, they moved into banking and were even issuing their own credit cards. After taking over the reins in 2002, only 3 years after the company was founded, Markus Braun had global ambitions for the company. In a company Christmas party in 2009, he stated that English would now become the company's official language. This was to reflect its global ambitions. However, according to a former staff member, this drew awkward reactions as only half of the staff at the time spoke English, and many of them couldn't understand what Braun was even saying. As the company became more successful, Braun edged billionaire status. He appeared to exhibit the image of what a tech leader should look like. Speaking at tech conferences, he began sporting the classic black turtleneck. After the Theranos episode, I find it funny how it's becoming a theme for frauds to try and imitate Steve Jobs. Regardless, Braun had every reason to believe that he was on the same trajectory as Jobs. Having grown the company to a top 30 stock in Germany, it made Wirecard a rare European tech success story. However, Braun himself seemed to be somewhat disjointed from the rest of the company. He created a barrier between himself and most of the company. He worked on a floor only accessible by senior members. Leaving work meant getting on an elevator directly to a car park where a chauffeur waited for him in a Mercedes. He would be driven away to a building where he owned 2 apartments and had, on occasion, told his neighbors about his plans to buy their apartments too. By 2015, Wirecard now owned a bank in Munich and was transacting millions of online credit card payments. Braun was the face of the company, speaking with investors while his protege, Jan Marsalek, was jetting around the world closing business deals. Many saw Braun as a tech visionary. Analysts and investors truly believed that this was a newfound German fintech version of Steve Jobs. They praised him as, quote, the innovative spirit of Wirecard and a, quote, mastermind. However, not everyone was believing the hype. Toby Clothier, head of Mirabaud Security Strategy Team, recalls his impressions of Braun to the Financial Times. Quote, the thing we found odd was his obsession with certain words. His all-time favorite word was strong. We know because we counted. Other favorites were machine learning and ecosystem. If you were very gullible, then you might say he's a tech visionary, but if you look closer, it was all gobbledygook. End quote. In 2017, Braun had told investors that the latest artificial intelligence was being used to process and analyze data in Wirecard systems. However, it's been reported by the Financial Times that behind the scenes, Wirecard staff were merely using Excel spreadsheets to organize the information. Another skeptic, Henrik Lieber, had met Braun at an event organized by Goldman Sachs. Upon asking about the strategy and technology of his company, Lieber received what to be considered abstract and evasive answers, almost as if they were being pre-written or being read out by a machine. Hendrik knew that this was a bad sign, and his fund sold all of their Wirecard shares several weeks after the pair met. From time to time, Braun liked to remind people of his power, all coming from his 7% share in his company. It's reported that Braun often checked the share price on his phone and would give verbal blasts to senior management if the price fell, demanding that they fix it. He would even take out large loans using the 7% share as collateral. So you can imagine how Braun felt when KPMG released a scathing report on Wirecard's financials in April of 2020. At a recorded town hall meeting, Braun can be seen fuming with rage. But before we get to this moment, let's figure out how the company got there.
On the one hand, you have 23 buy ratings from analysts out of the 29 that I counted on the Bloomberg today. On the other hand, there seems to be nonstop controversy coming from the Financial Times, SIRF, and a number of other places that create the kind of volatility I don't think German investors are used to. Why is that there's so much controversy surrounding your company?
I think we have a tremendous growth development before us. We have big innovations before us. So this is what we concentrate on. I do not too much look into controversies. My message is I think we have a very strong year before us. We are concentrated on technology innovations.
The first time that Wirecard faced scrutiny was back in 2008. Financial auditors from the firm Ernst & Young were called to review allegations in the company's balance sheets. However, strangely, on this occasion, the two men that had blown the whistle were prosecuted by German authorities due to undisclosed stock positions.
Under the eyes of BaFin, the German Financial Supervision Authority, we saw the biggest stock market scandal in recent German history. And as you have explained to your listeners, BaFin was more busy with pursuing journalists who wrote about the dodgy business practices of Wirecard.
The reasoning was, these two men would write bad about Wirecard and then bet on the price going down before the news breaks in order to make some money. This is called short selling. It would be the same claims of short selling that Wirecard would use a decade later to defend itself against claims coming from investigative journalists.
Klipsch, featuring legendary sound with premium comfort.
At the Financial Times. As Wirecard's stock grew, so did the questions. Reports of financial irregularities surfaced, and there were claims that the company's operations were far smaller than what they appeared on paper. It also seemed, no matter how the economy was doing, Wirecard was always thriving. In 2015, it was reported that there was a €250 million gap in the company's balance sheet, the equivalent of 3 years of profit for the company. Wirecard dismissed this as short seller-backed propaganda, and analysts agreed. Merely a year later in 2016, claims surfaced again that the company was involved in money laundering. Again, Wirecard denied all of the allegations, but this drew investigations from both the German financial watchdog and private agencies. Then something strange happened. Over the next few years, journalists and short sellers who had spoken negatively about Wirecard's operations began to systematically receive phishing emails designed to compromise their computers. However, it hasn't been completely verified that Wirecard was responsible. In 2018, the company pushed into the DAX 30 index. This meant that Wirecard became an automatic stock in the portfolio of countless German pension funds. They were now partnering with German stores such as Audi and almost 100 airlines. At their peak, the company was worth $28 billion, but it was the start of 2019 when things started to escalate. There was an internal investigation at Wirecard's Singapore office over fraud. Money had supposedly been sent to India and back in order to falsely increase the number of transactions. This was to make it look like the company was doing more business than it actually was. In order to process payments in countries where Wirecard didn't have a license, they would use third-party companies. Some of these were in Singapore, Dubai, but most importantly, the Philippines. Strangely, the Philippines office was shared with a bus company, perhaps a sign that things weren't as they seemed. Since Wirecard didn't have an operating license in these regions, the idea was that these foreign companies would do the payment processing for Wirecard, and Wirecard would receive a commission. This ended up being a huge part of Wirecard's business, pretty much all of its profit, 1.9 billion euros or $2 billion worth. Investigators found that there was no money coming into Wirecard's Munich bank. It was curious, but Wirecard explained it away to the auditors that there was actually a set of accounts managed at two banks in the Philippines. So, the investigators went to the Philippines. Upon arriving to visit Wirecard's partner company in the Philippines, the Financial Times reported having found a retired man and his family who was surprised to find out that their home was supposedly a branch of a multinational company. At this point, Wirecard were furious and sued the Financial Times for, quote, misuse of trade secrets. A month later, in a strange vote of confidence, SoftBank invested a further 900 million euros into Wirecard. It just seems like SoftBank can't get a break.
I think SoftBank shares with us the vision that the area of digital payments in combination with analytics, artificial intelligence, innovative financial services on one platform is one of the most interesting growth areas in the next 10 years.
Regardless, towards the end of 2019, among mounting investor pressure, Wirecard appoints the accounting company KPMG to perform an audit. It was going to prove that all the allegations against Wirecard were groundless. 6 months later, in early 2020, KPMG reports it cannot verify, quote, the lion's share of Wirecard's profits over the last 2 years. Wirecard's CEO Markus Braun vigorously denied all claims of wrongdoing. And then, in early June, German police raided the Munich headquarters. What Wirecard had claimed the whole time was that they were using third parties to process payments. These third parties would then give Wirecard a commission, netting them $2 billion and the majority of their profit. The reality was, it all appears to be an accounting sham. The $2 billion wasn't in the Philippines. The banks that were supposed to be holding the Wirecard money told investigators that they had no idea what they were talking about. The bank stated that this money simply didn't exist.
No money, none of Wirecard's missing $2.1 billion ever entered into the Philippines. And we're hearing from Wirecard itself that they now believe that the $2.1 billion probably does not exist. Now, as you may recall, on Friday, BPI and BDO, the two top Philippine banks, had revealed that they did not have any relationship with Wirecard, and it is now indicated that the documents that indicate the presence of some funds in those banks were bogus.
Over the next week, Markus Braun resigns, and he's arrested shortly after.
Markus Braun has been arrested. Now this is obviously a scandal that is becoming or is deepening. It is no longer only about missing money. Wirecard is saying that potentially up to 1.9 billion euros could be missing. It's now also obviously a criminal investigation, and one that is serious enough for the prosecutors to take this step and actually arrest and detain the former CEO.
Wirecard then makes a statement. They admit that the money probably never existed in the first place. Shortly after, they file for insolvency. Jan Marsalek, Wirecard's former chief operating officer and Markus's right-hand man, has vanished. German newspapers report that he fled to Russia or Belarus. There has been ripple effects from the collapse. German pensioners have lost money. Other payment companies owned by Wirecard were thrown into chaos. For example, the firm Pocket has had to freeze funds for its UK clients, leaving some in danger of having no hot water or gas.
Hi, it's Nancy from the International Rescue Committee. I'm at Przemyśl train station in Poland, where many people are arriving on trains.
And with that is the end of the Wirecard saga. It's how a company went from a small startup to superstardom in the European tech world to losing 99% of its share price in just over a week. The story raises questions of the effectiveness of regulators, auditors, rating agencies, and financial watchdogs who all let it happen right under their noses. Was there corruption involved to have this go on for over a decade? Perhaps time will tell.
When the Financial Times was starting to report about irregularities when it comes to their accounting, that was rebuffed violently by Wirecard, but also the German regulator didn't really look into the matter thoroughly. Instead of it, they actually looked into whether the Financial Times journalist has done its job Right. So today, and also already it started yesterday, there's a huge discussion in Germany whether or not everybody was far too lenient on the company, because nobody apparently looked really into the business model, neither the regulator nor also the analyst. At some point in time, one analyst from a very well-known bank here in Germany called the reporting from the Financial Times fake news. Apparently, Wirecard was always shielded somewhat as the poster child of being a tech company in Germany, which we don't have too many of.
While the story isn't over just yet, it seems like the company itself might be. Thanks for watching. In case you missed the last episode on the greatest phone failures in mobile history, this video was brought to you by Morning Brew. Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. William Shakespeare once said, "No legacy is so rich as honesty." 500 years later, it appears that there are many who fail to understand this. If honesty creates legacies, then dishonesty destroys it. The story of WorldCom is about destroying a potential legacy with pure dishonesty. WorldCom was a US telecommunications company who provided phone and mobile services. Valued at over $100 billion, they were one of the largest companies in the world at the time. So how on earth do you destroy a $100 billion company in a matter of months? In this episode, we'll take a look at the lies, deceit, and greed that made this feat possible.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
The story began in 1983 when the breakup of AT&T left a gaping hole in the long-distance telephone market. Sensing an opportunity, a group of men met at a coffee shop in Jacksonville, Mississippi. What would come out of this meeting would later become WorldCom, but was first incorporated as Long Distance Discount Service. For simplicity's sake, we'll refer to the company Long Distance Discount Service as WorldCom in the early days. One of the men in the meeting was Bernie Ebbins, a stern man but hard worker. And at this time, little did he know that this small venture would later make him one of the highest paid executives in the United States. There'll be much more on Bernie later. In 1995, Long Distance Discount Services would officially be renamed to WorldCom. The company's business model was simple. WorldCom didn't build landline cables or cell phone towers, but would instead rent out this infrastructure from other companies. This expense was known as line cost, a point that will be vital to the understanding of the crux of the story, so keep that in mind. Using this existing infrastructure, WorldCom would then provide cell phone and landline service to customers at a discounted rate. The income from customers would hopefully be enough to offset any expenses. The company's initial years were a bit rough. Till 1985, they made losses repeatedly. As the company went into a debt of $1.5 million, the owners decided to hand over the reins to Bernie Ebbins, making him both the president and CEO. Bernie was somewhat of a nobody before getting into the telecom business. He was a former high school basketball coach who later cut his business teeth in the motel business. Bernie was well known to save every penny he could at any chance he got during that time. He personally would clean all the motel rooms and wash the bedding instead of paying someone else to do it. Now the CEO of WorldCom, he was ruthless in his efforts to gain profits and started controlling costs immediately, even to the point of stopping the company's free coffee policy. Despite maybe going a bit too far, his efforts ensured a revenue rise within the first few months of him taking charge. In 1986, revenue rose to $8.6 million, and a year later grew to $18 million. In spite of this, competition in the market was tough, with multiple companies providing similar services. To grow more rapidly, Bernie started following a different strategy. WorldCom either acquired regional rivals or merged with other companies. Over the next 10 years, Bernie purchased 30 companies. The company was officially named WorldCom in 1995, and saw its sales reach nearly $1 billion. WorldCom's largest merger took place in 1998 when it merged with MCI Communications, a company 2.5 times its size. The $37 billion merger was finalized on September 15, 1998. It was the largest company merger in history at the time of its announcement. The company was renamed to MCI WorldCom after this. WorldCom CEO Bernie Ebbers became somewhat of a Wall Street renegade hero with his casual dress sense and salesman attitude. By the year 2000, WorldCom employed 88,000 people and owned 60,000 miles of telephone line, not just in the US but around the world. Its revenues were to cross $40 billion, and the stock was flying. Bernie, by now, was receiving $27 million in WorldCom stock options. To fund a lavish lifestyle, he would take out loans from JP Morgan and secure them with WorldCom stock. According to CNBC, a total of $408 million was taken out to buy yachts, then a yacht building company, and not to mention the largest privately owned ranch on planet Earth. Around this time, WorldCom was already in the process of completing a merger with Sprint Corporation. This was supposed to be the biggest merger in history. The $115 billion deal was going to establish WorldCom as the world leader in the industry. The deal, however, would be blocked due to antitrust objections.
If this deal were to go forward, consumers and businesses would pay the price because competition would be reduced in many important telecommunications markets.
The genesis of the WorldCom fraud lay in the failing of the Sprint Corporation acquisition. This essentially exhausted all options of growth through mergers and acquisitions. As mentioned in the beginning, it was a strategy that the company had followed in the 90s to grow rapidly. By the late 90s and 2000, the competition in the market became too intense and it became increasingly difficult to grow through the acquisition route too. Even though the internet was just getting started, it seemed that the long-distance telecommunication cash cow was drying up. Being in the infrastructure game wasn't as profitable as it once was. The telecom industry was hit hard on Wall Street, and WorldCom stock went from $62 a share in 1999 to just $18 a share in the year 2000. Despite WorldCom being a massive player, things were looking bad, so they got desperate. Late in 1999, head accountant David Myers brought in some financial earnings paperwork to Chief Financial Officer Scott Sullivan. Sullivan looked at the papers and said, "There must be a mistake. This couldn't be right, as company profits were down the drain." He asked David to go back and check again. He did, and the accounting department came back with the same number. Scott, annoyed by now, asked David to check another time. He did, and he came back with the same number. This wasn't good. WorldCom was a public company, and the earnings report was due soon. Scott Sullivan, being the CFO, still insisted that the numbers must be wrong. He directed Dave Myers to write down financial entries to make the numbers what he thought they should be. It will all be fine in the end because the pair would figure out the problem by the next earnings release. But when the next quarter came around, David was instructed to repeat the same fraud again. And in the next quarter, he was asked to do the same thing.
The real pressure that the accounting department was put under was producing an entry that was based on the CFO's thought process of what he thought the number should be as opposed to what we knew the underlying answer was.
On realizing that just making fake entries wasn't going to be enough to make the margins look impressive, CFO Scott Sullivan asked David to do something drastic. He would take the costs of renting cell and landline infrastructure and book them down as assets. This was to make WorldCom appear financially healthy. So what exactly did booking infrastructure renting costs as assets mean? Well, an asset is something that a company pays for that will give a future economic benefit. To understand the difference more, let's look a little deeper. Assets are the resources available to a business, whereas expenses are the resources consumed while running a business. Assets are reported for a specific date on the balance sheet, while expenses are reported for an entire accounting period in an income statement. Writing down these line rental costs and infrastructure costs as assets that would generate revenue was illegal. According to internal auditor Glenn Smith, instead of expensing the cost of infrastructure rental at a monthly basis, they were taking those costs and moving them to the balance sheet, where they would be expensed over a 10 to 15 year period, so this makes the costs appear lower per month. This in turn would make income look much better when viewed on a short-term quarterly basis. It wouldn't be long before WorldCom internal auditors noticed something strange in the accounting books. It would spell the end for one of the biggest American companies. The fraud was unearthed by WorldCom's Vice President of Internal Audit, Cynthia Cooper, and also Glenn Smith. Cynthia's suspicion first arose when she came across the term prepaid capacity. This was during a meeting with Corporate Finance Director Sanjeev Sethi. Cynthia and Glenn inquired about what the term meant, but nobody seemed to know, including Sethi himself. Cynthia started pursuing the financial entries made under the term, and in the company's accounting system, she discovered $3 billion of bogus entries, all on the company's balance sheets. She then questioned Scott Sullivan about it during a meeting. Sullivan stated that prepaid capacity was the cost of leasing fiber optic lines that were being underutilized. The idea was that these purchases would yield income as the internet increased in popularity. However, Cynthia was not convinced that these needed to be booked as assets instead of expenses.
Remember, this is during the dot-com boom, and we purchased all that anticipating that all of that capacity would be grabbed. I mean, it would be gone by the time we had bought it. And so when the dot-com bubble burst, those were what's called dark fiber, so there was no traffic on those. And so all of a sudden, now we were locked into these 3-year leases where we're having to pay monthly on those, but we've got no revenue to offset those. And so as Scott explained it, so really what he was saying is that's really capacity we've prepaid for that we anticipate at some time we'll have traffic for. So it's really an asset of ours that we're going to go capitalize on the balance sheet. So fantastic business case, and if you explain that to somebody off the street, they would say, okay, that makes sense.
I was convinced.
But GAAP says you can't do that, right? And so Cynthia and I left that and both just sort of looked at each other and said, did we hear what we thought we just heard?
It wasn't easy for Cynthia. Attempts were made to discourage her from pursuing the matter. Scott Sullivan once called her on the phone while she was at a hair salon, only to tell her not to discuss the matter with Anderson auditors. Pursuing it further, she started interviewing the accountants who had made the entries, only to discover that they didn't know why those entries were being made in the first place. They were just doing as they were told by their seniors. Before we continue, I just want to take a quick second to thank today's sponsor, Morning Brew. So what do you usually do when you wake up in the morning? Probably pick up your phone. Bernie Ebbers, who was now of lumber alone, is causing home prices to jump by $36,000. If you're interested in business, finance, or tech, subscribe to Morning Brew. It's completely free and takes less than 15 seconds to subscribe. Click the link in the description below to get started. As Cynthia's investigation continued, David Myers would admit that the entries were made up, but Scott Sullivan, however, defended the fraudulent entries. The audit committee asked KPMG, an external auditing firm, to conduct their own review. KPMG asked Sullivan for an explanation. He couldn't give a satisfying answer. Meanwhile, Bernie Ebbers, who was now one of the highest paid executives in the country, continued painting an optimistic picture for the stock market. All the while, he was busy building and protecting his own personal financial empire. He continued to feed Wall Street expectations of double-digit growth.
Is WorldCom a financially sound, solid, surviving company?
Absolutely. We are free cash flow positive. We announced that today.
As the telecommunications industry was shifting and the WorldCom stock began to plunge, the banks now wanted their money back from Bernie. Remember, he had secured loans with WorldCom stock as collateral. To avoid Bernie selling the stock and spooking the market, the WorldCom board of directors gave him a $408 million loan. On April 29, 2002, Bernie was asked to resign due to his personal loan problems. On June 25, 2002, the WorldCom board makes the decision to go public with the investigation. WorldCom would fire Scott Sullivan and David Myers would resign.
Thank you for having me.
What do you want to say to the shareholder out there that's holding WorldCom that just got the news that the SEC has conducted an informal inquiry?
It's a very difficult thing to know what to say because I don't have enough definition to what they're asking. It was not anticipated. It's a very time-consuming prospect because they ask a lot for a lot of information. But the thing that I feel very confident in my heart of hearts is that there are not issues that our shareholders ought to be concerned with respect to the investigation by the SEC. I would be the first to tell them if I thought there were some issues.
WorldCom announces that it's going to revise its financial statements for 2001 and the first quarter of 2002. It confessed that it had discovered $3.8 billion in fraudulent entries. As the investigation continued, still more bad news came. Earnings from the years 1999, 2000, and 2001 each had misclassified expenses as assets. The total fraud would measure $11 billion. This led to one of the largest public company accounting frauds in history coming out into the open. With the scandal just breaking 1 year after Enron, American business clearly had a problem. To avoid bankruptcy, WorldCom immediately laid off 17,000 employees. That was equivalent to 1/5 of the workforce. This couldn't save it though. WorldCom, along with all of its active US subsidiaries, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. With $107 billion in assets, it was the largest bankruptcy at the time. However, the company did rebrand itself as MCI to salvage the blow to its reputation due to the fraudulent WorldCom. This new company was bought by Verizon in 2006 for $8 billion. Though investors in WorldCom were unfortunately hit the hardest in the scandal. The New York State Common Retirement Fund, which is one of the largest public pension funds in the US, lost over $300 million. And as WorldCom stock fell off a cliff, investors collectively lost $30 billion. On March 24, 2004, charges were filed against the main actors in WorldCom. In the legal case, the prosecution stated that Bernie was motivated by greed. His wealth was in WorldCom stock, and he had to keep that stock high at all costs. Bernie had financial targets and asked the CFO to meet these targets by any means necessary. But others would argue that Bernie knew nothing of the fraud. The judge didn't agree though, and by the next year, he was arrested. CFO Scott Sullivan and David Myers were handcuffed in New York and paraded in front of TV cameras. In 2005, David Myers was sentenced to 1 year in jail, while Sullivan was given 5 years. Disgraced CEO Bernie Ebbins, under whose leadership the fraud took place, was charged with security fraud and conspiracy. Bernie pled not guilty, but the charges were proven and he was given a sentence of 25 years. He was released 12 years early in December of 2019 due to his poor health. He would die shortly after his release in February last year. The SEC investigation concluded that, quote, Ebbers was aware, at a minimum, that WorldCom was meeting revenue expectations through financial gimmickry, end quote. In 2009, Time magazine named him the 10th most corrupt CEO of all time. The WorldCom fraud is interesting because despite its severity, it was pretty simply done by misclassifying and incorrectly reporting numbers. It didn't involve WorldCom's network, its technology, or its engineering. Most of the workforce at the company didn't even know that it was going on. Only those at the helm of the company's finances knew what was really happening. Even the board of directors were not aware that a fraud this massive was being conducted right under their noses. As per the investigation by the SEC, the fraud continued this long because of the lack of courage to blow the whistle on senior officials. It's amazing how such things can go unquestioned in such a large company because everyone expects that the person above them is doing the right thing. Today I wonder, are there any future WorldComs out there? So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section below or head over to the Discord for discussion. In the next episode, we'll take a look at the Archegos scandal, where $20 billion was lost in 2 days. If you want to get notified when that video comes out, make sure you're subscribed to Cold Fusion. Alright, so that's it. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion, and I'll catch you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys. Have a good one.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.
Look at these adorable dogs enjoying high-speed home internet for business and personal use.
With natural gas. Eventually, the company moved on to trading, making energy deals in power, and then later moving on to broadband and even trading the weather. They were Wall Street's darling, the company that could never lose, and its stock price kept growing year on year. The company was also well connected politically. For example, Enron was the single biggest contributor to the George W. Bush campaign. Bush even called Kenneth Lay, the founder of Enron, Kenny Boy. And it's with Kenny Boy that the story starts. Growing up in a poor family, Kenneth Lay's father was a Baptist priest. The young Ken would often ponder about his future, a future where he could escape his current conditions. When he grew up, he became a prominent figure in the deregulation of the energy sector. The PhD graduate spent his time as a financial analyst in the Pentagon before climbing the ranks and becoming close friends with George Bush Sr. Ken Lay would even send the Enron corporate jet to take George Sr. and his wife to their son's inauguration. As you'll see later, these favors did not go unreturned. The first red flag for the founder of the company, Kenneth Lay, that something was wrong within the company came during the Valhalla scandal of 1987. Two oil traders working for Enron gambled enormously on the company's behalf, shifting money to fake accounts with names such as MY Arse or My Arse. Worried auditors told Lay that they found the two traders moving money into their own accounts, manipulating earnings, and gambling on trades beyond their capacity. But instead of firing the two rogue traders, Lay made no changes. Didn't seem to matter what they were doing, as long as they were making the company money. Enron even sent them a letter saying, "Please keep making us millions." Later, the two were convicted of fraud. Ken Lay acted shocked, saying that he was not aware of their reckless gambling and theft. But as revealed later, he actually encouraged it. One of the convicted traders was sent to jail for a year, and this gave Ken Lay a big problem. One of his main moneymakers was behind bars, and he needed someone new to bring in cash. Enter Jeffrey Skilling. Skilling, Enron's new CEO, was Lay's biggest asset. When he arrived at Enron, he started moving the company in a new direction. Skilling wanted to turn Enron from a gas supply company into a stock market for natural gas. He also introduced the company to mark-to-market accounting, an idea that would allow the company to fraudulently reap billions. So mark-to-market accounting simply allows the company to write down profits in their books on the day that the deal was signed. This meant that if Enron signed a deal worth $50 million over the next 10 years, they could write $50 million in their books that day. Despite not receiving a penny, it didn't even matter if the deal fell through. Effectively, this meant that the company was worth more on paper than it had actually earned. The deals were often subjective. They could be worth whatever Enron thought they were worth. When the Security and Exchange Commission approved the accounting trick of mark-to-market for Enron, the office celebrated. They knew that this was the key to making billions. Meanwhile, Skilling was known for his Darwinian philosophy, survival of the fittest. His favorite book, The Selfish Gene, describes how greed and competition motivate human nature. At Enron, Skilling wanted to unlock these instincts in his employees. One way he did this was grading all employees on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the best and 5 being the worst. The thing was, 10% of all employees had to be graded a 5, and when you were graded a 5, you were fired. This created the competition that Skilling was looking for. People began to work 18 hours a day and were ruthless in their efforts to earn the company as much money as possible. Skilling famously said that money was the only thing that motivated people. Unsurprisingly, Skilling was a massive risk taker. He often went on wild adventures with other Enron executives. This includes dirt biking on dangerous trails where people often flip their cars. An executive even required stitches after a biking accident on one of these trips. Skilling said he liked guys like this, guys with a bit of edge. Lau Pai, a mild-mannered executive, was one of these guys with a bit of edge. Skilling called Lau Pai his ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. He was CEO of an Enron subsidiary and seemed to be motivated by 2 things: money and strippers. Pai isn't as mysterious as one can be in such a huge scandal. He left Enron in 2001 with $250 million and became the second largest landowner in Colorado. He left his business division with $1 billion of losses and escaped the whole scandal pretty much intact. Pai would come back later into this story, a few decades after the dust settles.
Enron Online will change the markets for many, many commodities. It is creating an open, transparent marketplace that replaces the dark, blind system that existed. It is real simple. You turn on your computer, and it's right there. And if you want to do business, you push the button. That's our vision. We're trying to change the world.
And it wasn't just internet companies feeling the fever. Enron's stock had tripled in the space of 2 years. Everyone with a little bit of spare cash was playing the stock market game. Enron knew that as long as the company met or exceeded analyst expectations, the stock price would keep rising. And somehow, they always met or exceeded those expectations. During this time, while Jeff Skilling stood at the company's conventions telling his staff to put more of their 401k into Enron, he knew that the profits were actually going in the opposite direction. Around the world, they were losing billions on natural gas projects. Enron had poured billions of dollars into a plant in India, only to realize that India couldn't afford to buy the electricity. The site lay in ruins, but that didn't stop the executives at Enron writing down future profits for the project into their books and handing themselves massive bonuses. The analysts, the very people who were supposed to stop the corruption, fell under the spell of Skilling. The complexity of the company and the charisma of Skilling made analysts simply take him at his word. In fact, the ones that didn't were fired. The company soon began trading bandwidth after some .com inspiration. They made a deal with Blockbuster to provide streaming services, but the technology just simply didn't work well enough yet. The deal fell through, but Enron still wrote $53 million in their books for it. Things began to get out of control, and Enron soon began trading weather. Yes, the weather, like sunshine and rain. They would soon sell futures on the weather, essentially gambling what the temperature would be. You would probably imagine that most people would be skeptical of this, but it was activities like this that led Enron to being listed on the Fortune 500's most innovative companies list. But one reporter at Fortune would soon start asking questions, and this would later lead to the company's demise. Bethany McLean, a reporter at Fortune, was doing a piece on Enron. She had a phone call with John Skilling where she asked him simple questions like, how exactly does Enron make its money? Skilling said he couldn't answer because he wasn't an accountant, so he sent a few finance guys, including Andy Fustow, the CFO, to answer her questions the next day. They sat in the office for 3 hours poring over documents. At the end, as others had left the room, Andy turned to the reporter and said, I don't care what you write about the company, just don't make us look bad. Andy Fustow was a character described as having no moral compass. He made Enron debts disappear by moving them to shell companies so that on paper, Enron was profitable. He even set up his own fraudulent firm just to buy Enron assets. This fraudulent firm was called LJM. Andy would later convince 96 bankers to invest in the scam LJM firm. LJM would make Andy Fustow $45 million, but it seemed that the banks were in on the deal too. Merrill Lynch bought 3 Nigerian barges from Enron and sold them back 5 months later. This was to help Enron cook their books, and later, several bankers would go to jail for this. Both Skilling and Lay knew that even this couldn't last forever. They needed a new gold mine. And then, they turned their eyes to the Golden State, California. Now,
the Thor Freedom Elite 23H is an easy-to-drive family motorhome. With a bunk-over cab, dream dinette, and a queen-size bed, you can easily sleep full.
Skilling became increasingly volatile, arriving at work unshaved and red-eyed. On a 2001 investor's call, he even called an investor an a-hole. A brash reaction from a Fortune 500 CEO. The pressure was getting to him. The company had to keep making quarterly targets despite their businesses failing at home and abroad. California was going to be their next big score. Enron merged with Pacific Gas and Electric, which gave them access to the Californian grid. Once this was achieved, strange things began to happen. In the newly deregulated electricity market of California, rolling blackouts became common. But strangely, the state had almost double the capacity than there was demand. So why was this happening? It turns out Enron traders were manipulating the market. They moved electricity out of state to increase demand, and when the price got high enough, they would move it back in. They even called power plants and asked them to make excuses to shut down for a few hours, increasing the price as there was less demand. Traders had energy maps and the control to move the energy. They knew exactly how to squeeze every last dollar from the people of California. While the state faced blackouts causing unknown tolls on the lives of Californians, the Enron traders were high-fiving themselves over their bonuses. Ken Lay even said, "It doesn't matter how many rules you Californians make, I got a bunch of smart people here that will figure out how to make money anyway." The year-long ordeal would cost California $30 billion. But why didn't the state put a stop to it? Well, the law states that it's a federal government issue, and it's their responsibility to take care of it. And guess who the president was at the time? That's right, Lay's good friend, George W. Bush. Bush refused to step in, saying that it was his administration's belief that intervention would not solve anything. The Federal Energy Regulation Commission also didn't step in until the Senate forced them to. The chairman of the commission was personally recommended by Kenneth Lay. This whole ordeal caused the people of California to turn on their governor and appoint a new one that was more suitable for the role, the Terminator. One day in 2001, out of the blue, Skilling suddenly resigned. Perhaps he figured he could leave the company years before it imploded. Then he could say, well, it was fine when I left it. Regardless, Kenneth Lay took over the CEO role. Just one day later, Sharon Watkins, who worked under the company's CFO, Andrew Fostow, sent a letter to Kenneth Lay detailing the staggering amount of corruption and fraud that she'd found within the company. The Wall Street Journal would write a piece about some of Andy's dealings, and soon, the SEC would launch an informal inquiry. At this point, investors began to feel nervous. Kenneth Lay tried to bring calm and reassurance to investors and employees. While he was addressing the company's issue to a speech to employees, just several blocks away, Enron's accounting firm was busy shredding documents. One of the accounting firms shredded 1 ton of paper on October the 23rd, but it was too late. The walls began to fall, and over the course of a month, the company went from that healthy appearance of one of the leading innovators to total bankruptcy.
You want us to believe that you sat there in your office and had no clue that this place was about to collapse?
On the day I left, on August 14th, 2001, I believe the company was in strong financial condition. I did not do anything wrong. That was not in the interest. And all the time that I worked for Enron Corporation, that was in the interest of the shareholders of the company. If I could go back and redo things, I would not. Now.
For the thousands of people who held Enron stock, the market was frozen at the $32 mark, and when it reopened, it was $9 a share. Meanwhile, Enron executives had a fire sale of all of their stock. In the months leading up to the bankruptcy, Skilling told his employees to buy more stock while he sold all of his. As the media began circling the story, criminal investigations were launched. Cliff Baxter, a trader who often went on Skilling's wild adventures, cashed in $30 million from Enron. After being called to testify in court, Baxter got in his Mercedes, drove down a quiet street, and shot himself. Andy Fostow, the former CFO, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He ratted out and cut himself a deal to testify against other Enron executives. He was sentenced to 10 years but only served 6 and paid $23 million in fines. Enron's accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, the one that shredded 1 ton of paper, was convicted of obstructing justice. America's oldest accounting firm collapsed due to the loss of reputation. 29,000 people lost their jobs. Ken Lay earned $300 million from Enron. He was found guilty of 10 counts of securities fraud and was facing 45 years in prison, but died of a heart attack a month before his sentencing. 20,000 people at Enron lost their jobs and medical insurance, with an average severance pay of only $4,500. Executives were paid $55 million during the bankruptcy and cashed a further $774 million in the year before the collapse. Skilling, the mastermind behind Enron, was convicted of 19 counts of security and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 24 years and $180 million in fines. While in jail, his parents and his son passed away. He only served 12 years of his 24-year sentence and was released in early 2019. But this isn't where the story ends. Skilling is hoping that he can get a second chance. He appears to be plotting a return to the energy sector. Only 2 months after his prison release in early 2019, Skilling was entered as a manager of a new company which he founded a few years ago. Lau Pai, the former Enron executive who sailed off into the sunset with his $250 million, is reported to be helping Skilling regain connections and funding. According to the Wall Street Journal, Skilling has been holding meetings with former Enron executives in relation to starting a new venture. This may be difficult for him as obviously his reputation has been massively smeared. But apart from people's perception, there's technically nothing stopping him. The SEC has banned Skilling from being an officer of any public company, so as long as his venture stays private, he can do whatever he wants. So that is the story of Enron, with a not-so-typical ending. Despite being one of the biggest players and the biggest scam,
friends would walk up to me and just be like, "What the f is in your mug?" And I would just tell them, "It's mud."
Does WeWork's implosion pose a systemic risk? The company went from a $47 billion valuation to near bankruptcy in just 6 weeks. It's been a kind of a phenomenal story to watch.
WeWork is facing a cash crunch at its current burn rate of $700 million a quarter. It's probably going to run out of money by the first half of next year.
How and what is this company going to do if it doesn't hit the public market and raise that money?
Hi, welcome to another Cold Fusion video. The idea of a modern-day tech company is shrouded in glamour, casual dress, cutting-edge tech, and a collaborative atmosphere which frees workers from mundane, pigeonholed work. This dream is exactly what WeWork sells to people. WeWork rents out co-working offices to freelancers, small business owners, and even some tech Open Spaces Vision Fund. We've covered Sun and his SoftBank company in a previous video. His rags to riches story is really amazing in itself, and I'll leave a link for that below. Sun had made perhaps one of the greatest investments of all time just a few decades earlier when he gave a young Jack Ma $20 million to fund Alibaba. In 2017, Sun famously met with Adam for just 12 minutes before deciding to invest $4.4 billion. Sun had found a new apprentice in Adam Neumann, and in Sun, Neumann had found a mentor. But Sun's belief in Neumann, while it gave way to his rise, may also have been part of the reason for his eventual downfall. Over the coming decades, WeWork used money from its investors to amass 847 locations across 123 cities globally. In fact, WeWork was central London's biggest office occupier, and also the biggest private office tenant in Manhattan. But Adam Neumann had bigger dreams for the company than just renting office spaces. Rebranding as the We Company, along with WeWork, there's also WeLive, essentially renting furnished apartments. And more interestingly, WeGrow, which in its own words is a, quote, conscientious entrepreneurial school for young children with tuition fees between $22,000 and $42,000. The school is again in its own words, quote, committed to elevating the collaborative consciousness of the world, end quote. WeGrow is run by Hi, welcome to another. You would probably imagine that most people would be skeptical of this, but it was activities like this to pay off old investors while taking a cut. So stay tuned till the end of the episode to learn about that one. Let's get into it.
You're watching Cold Fusion TV.
So first of all, what is a Ponzi scheme? A Ponzi scheme is an investment fraud. The scheme promises high and sometimes quick returns, but in reality, it's just paying off existing investors with funds collected from new investors who have also been fooled by the promise of a quick buck. Ponzi schemes use money from their new investors to pay off old investors while taking a cut for themselves. Since there is no money being earned by selling a product or a service, Ponzi schemes require a constant flow of new money to sustain. Not surprisingly, after a time, it becomes increasingly harder to find new investors, and when that happens, the scheme fails. A Ponzi scheme is not to be confused with a pyramid scheme. A pyramid scheme requires recruitment to bring in more people to increase their returns. A Ponzi scheme may or may not need that. For example, a Ponzi scheme would be something like BitConnect, a fake cryptocurrency that promised huge returns from a mysterious AI trading algorithm. But in reality, it used money from old investors to pay off new investors.
And let me tell you that we are really changing the world as we know it. The world is not anymore the way it used to be. No. Be connected. Wow.
Thousands of victims swindled out of more than $2 billion may be receiving some justice after one of the leaders of a crypto scheme pleaded guilty.
This is believed to be the biggest cryptocurrency fraud ever charged criminally.
He says this scam, run through a crypto lending program called BitConnect, is believed to have swindled thousands of people around the world out of more than $2 billion worth of Bitcoin.
They claim that if you traded your Bitcoin for their currency, cryptocurrency called the BitConnect coin, that a trading bot would make sure that you didn't lose any money.
Also offering investors returns as high as 40% per month. But prosecutors say BitConnect actually operated like a Ponzi scheme, using investor funds to repay other BitConnect investors.
A pyramid scheme, on the other hand, relies heavily on recruiting, so something like MetaLife, where members would sell supplements and take a cut of the sales of those who they recruited, forming a pyramid. Now, have you ever wondered why an unusual word like Ponzi is associated with financial fraud? It's named as such because it's named after a man named Charles Ponzi. So who was Charles Ponzi? Charles Ponzi was a swindler known for starting a scheme of this kind in 1920 in Boston. Charles Ponzi was born in 1882 in Italy. As a young boy, he kept stealing from the church so much that his family got sick of him and deported him to America.